believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Rika, the Renz, also known as Ricky Brains, and a great episode for you today. Today, we have returning guest, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler. And last time he was on was episode 299, so go back in the archives and check that out. On that specific episode, we talked about a suppressed vax versus unvaxxed study, which he worked with Dr. Paul Thomas, who was also eventually on the Ripple Effect Podcast, episode 317, I believe. And check out that story. Fascinating story. But of course, today we talk a lot about current events. We talk a lot about what's going on in the world and where we think things are heading. But even though we talk a lot about COVID-19 and current events, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler is a very interesting guy who has a lot of very interesting perspectives. So we go much deeper in a lot of other really interesting topics. So hold on tightly. It's a really fun discussion. With that said, if you enjoyed this podcast or any of my podcasts, please consider supporting the show. Remember, this is a value for value show. If you get value out of this show in any way whatsoever, consider giving some value back. It doesn't have to be financially. If you can financially support the show, please do. I get thousands and thousands of downloads. And if everyone contributed $1, I could do this full time. So that puts in perspective how little everyone has to contribute to help me reach my goal of doing this show full time. And I do think this show is giving some value to the listeners. I think you guys enjoy the type of conversations I try to have. I think you enjoy the type of guests I have on, the honesty, the lack of pushing any ideology on you guys. So please try to give some value back if you can. We have a Patreon page. We have a PayPal account. We have a merch store. All this stuff will be in the show description. And we also have a crypto wallet if you want to donate that way. So there's plenty of ways of helping support the show. And no donation is too little. But like I said, if you can't support the show financially, rate the show, review the show, tell people about the show. That will help fight the algorithms that are suppressing podcasts like mine. Last but not least, check out my other show, The Union of the Unwanted, which I host with Sam Tripoli, Charlie Robinson, and Midnight Mike. And you'll be able to find all this in the show description, or you can go to therippleeffectpodcast.com. That's therippleeffectpodcast.com. And something I haven't mentioned in a long time, if you guys enjoy the music you hear on the Ripple Effect Podcast, look up my solo music project called Theory 6. The word theory and the number 6. The EP is called The Ripple Effect, and you can find the song called The Ripple Effect, which is the theme song to this podcast, on that EP. And you can find that music anywhere you can get digital downloads, iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, etc. Thanks again, guys, for listening. Enjoy this conversation, and I'll see you guys again. Dr. Jack, how are you, bud?
Wow, thanks for having me, and thanks for the patience in getting me back.
Yeah, well, I know you're busy. We live in a crazy world with a lot of stuff going on a daily basis, so I'm sure you've been very busy keeping up with everything.
You know it, brother.
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to start off by saying thank you for introducing me to Dr. Jessica Rhodes, who's become a fan favorite.
Yeah, right? She's something special, isn't she?
Yeah. It's funny because I've told the story on the show before. When you first introduced us and you suggested her coming on the show, I know you suggested her, and then I'm like, yeah, if she's a friend of yours, I assume that she'd probably make for a really good guest. But typically, like, I take the time to go do a little bit of research on the guest and try to find just see how, get a feel for their personality and who they are. That way I can kind of see if I can riff with them and just be a little bit better prepared before the show. And then I just got busy, and for some reason, maybe it was just a crazy time, and I never got around to doing any research on her.
Mhm.
And then I think either you or her wrote me an email saying like, hey, do you want to book something soon? Then I'm like, okay, let me just book it. And then I'll find time to look into her because I'm like, if she's a friend of Dr. Jack, I'm sure she'll be all right. And then,
Yeah, thank you.
I never got around to doing anything. And almost completely forgot that I'm like, I still have to do some research on her. And then like it was like the day of or the day before, I was like panicking because I'm like trying to do some research on her, and
Got it.
I couldn't find anything on her at the time. She's done like very little to no interviews. Her
Right.
website was very hard to find, and there wasn't a whole lot of personal information on there. And and then I felt like I was on a blind date. I'm like, oh my god, am I even gonna get along with this like I was like freaking out. And then like 2 seconds in the conversation we're talking about heavy metal and we're talking about this and that,
Yeah.
and then we end up having like a 3 hour conversation, and I'm like, wow, like you just never know, and who and I always say this, I'm like, sometimes like some of the most interesting guests that I have on the show are people who are lesser known, and some of the real like best-selling authors and all these people you expect to be the most intriguing people sometimes they're just regurgitating the same stuff and they're not that interesting. So it was fun, so thank you for that.
Yeah, she's definitely got some layers. I think the fact that I told you that she was a surfer chick probably got her in your door pretty quick, But I watched your first interview with her, and it was smash hit. You guys really did hit it off great, and you should. She's great. You're great. So I
Thank
knew
you.
you would.
I appreciate that. Yeah, well, you know what it is I find people fascinating who are into a lot of different stuff
Yeah,
because it seems like they can take things from all those hobbies and just interests, and it helps kind of look at things from different perspectives. So, like I've told her on the show, like the fact that we're doing podcasts about immune systems and health and our body and how the body works, but she's actually a athlete who implements some of this stuff and understands how the human body works and how
yeah,
amazing the human body is. It's like it gives her a perspective that's slightly different than somebody who only studies the human body but doesn't use their body as their experiment to like, oh, let me train this way, let me eat that way, and that type of stuff. So
she definitely has layers. That's
yeah.
awesome. Yeah,
And her research, obviously her and Dr. Peter McCullough hooked up, and so many other people have hooked up with her and referenced her work. She's done some amazing work. And so like I said in the beginning of this call, like obviously there's a lot going on and the narrative is changing very quick and catching up to people like yourself, which is, it's like the science hasn't changed, the narrative has just changed. What's with all the stuff going on right now, what's gotten your attention right now, and what do you think is the most important thing that's going on right now in regards to obviously COVID, the vaccines, and all that stuff?
well, I don't want to gloat, but I'm watching public health faceplant. I mean, this is some massive, unpredicted, absolute dismal failure. The words are endless that you can use to describe it, but the untrustworthiness of public health is apparent to so many people now that 2, 3 years ago, I would not have predicted that this was even remotely possible. And it's all due to their overreach and their hubris, counting on the same algorithms that misled the public over the pediatric vaccine schedule to plug and play as an algorithm that will work for disinformation on something as important as COVID, under the hot spotlight of everyone's viewpoint. And then the same point we're watching, of course, what I call the legacy media outlets. That's pronounced LAMO, by the way, LMO, also face planting, becoming less and less relevant. We kind of knew based on demographics that was happening because no one watches mainstream news except for the elderly, right? No one's going to plug into CNBC on purpose at 7 p.m. to make sure they catch the news. That's unheard of anymore. So, people take information on their own time frame when they can. And the fact that objective scientists like Dr. Rose and myself and others are better clued into that, we have a broader access and much more influence than we would have just 5 years ago. So obviously my eyes are on the next steps about exactly what's going to happen. with public health. I've made a formal proposal called Plan B to replace the CDC. People used to chuckle when I first, they used to laugh like, oh yeah, you're going to shut down CDC. Well, half of America now, at least politically, understands that there's a serious problem with pharma putting their thumb on the scale of every project that goes through FDA, and the FDA, acquiescing to or being actively complicit in fraud. I mean, these are huge things that are happening, right? I mean, it was a big deal to have Watergate. It was a big deal to have, the McCarthy era. It was a big deal for people to infringe on people's rights and say, are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And, for these, those in the middle, the remaining 45% maybe of Americans who really don't know that they're being made useful idiots for the globalists and the power struggle over global communism and freedom and the integrity of our liberties and rights in the United States. They're cannon fodder because they are going to get caught in the middle. Right? People that are awake, they live in places like Idaho. They're not going to be hurt by, any public health policy taking over the government of Idaho. But when we start seeing things like terms like health security, what is health security? You're not born with a right specifically to never get sick. Think about that. If you were told, right, I was born in 1967. I don't know, you were a 70s guy, 80s guy. When were you born, Ricky?
Born in 85.
85. I was graduating. You're a baby. I was graduating from high school in 85. Anyway, but anyway, if you were told when you were 5 years old, you know what? Here's a piece of paper. It's going to guarantee you that you are never going to get sick and you're never going to die from infectious disease, right? It's an inversion of liability and responsibility. Okay, I'm good. I don't have any self-responsibility here, right? You're not handed a card that when you're given your driver's license that says you're never going to be involved in a car accident. It's on you to be careful. Your personal responsibility is there. So this idea that we need strong and big government. In my own journey since we last spoke, I've interviewed a ton of people as well. And, going into individualism in a big way with Yaron Brooks. He's, the director of the Ayn Rand Institute. And just, watching so many people from so many different walks of life come to the same conclusion. That there is a globalist mentality, that there is a oligarchy that would like to have tyrannical total power. Just because they would be easier, they could get more vaccines out, they could rubber stamp more drugs, just because their days would be easier. Not for any other, humanitarian reason. And I don't think for an evil reason. Other people believe that there's this agenda to kill, hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. That, the power of the purse, the perverse power of the purse is enough for people to do things that are exactly the same as evil, right? Individual incentives. And we know this from the psychological studies about why people would harm other people under certain circumstances. And all it takes is a little bit of authoritarianism, right? That study of the people that would shock people in the other room, of course, and they had an actor over there screaming his full head off. The Millikan experiment shows you that it doesn't take anything to convert people if they feel that they're in a controlled environment with a specific powerful actor who has authority over them, who, by the way, is also judging them if they don't do it. Then they're willing to concede so much of their own humanity so quickly. And it's the same exact thing that somebody sells out. If somebody sells out to a bribe, or it's the same exact kind of, lack of the core character of ethics. Everyone needs to have an internal moral compass and decide who they're going to be. Everyone needs to make that decision. And there are people who have not, examined their own lives. It's unconscionable in these days and age just to join a group. You're part of this tribe. This is your clan. You're going to let the clan define you, who you are. That's unconscionable in an information age where there's so much information that you can access. But my heart goes out to people who You can't properly sort through, complex information or technical information. And that's why I created IPEC EDU. It's the online university that's teaching the public logic, reason, and science. We've got course after course after course and instructor after instructor signing on specifically to teach them the fundamentals of science and logic and reason. I trained a group of people how to do bioinformatics last summer, and I have grandmothers who are doing bioinformatics with results that are going to go into my peer-reviewed studies. One course in know-how. So, and I love grandmothers, nothing against grandmothers, but they don't have a technical background. They took Bio 1, Bio 2 with me. They fell in love with the entire idea that at this point in time in their life, they might actually be able to pick up a shovel or pick up they do something, right? We're in a war here. They declared war, public health declared war on us. So I've been, kind of riding this wave, the crest of this wave of conscious awareness about exactly what's happening and publishing it all in my Substack on popular rationalism, which is really super, popular. There's about, I think I have 10,000 reads per article now, which I'm really proud of, happy about, I should say. But I'll tell you, Ricky, in this economy of attention that we're all part of, with podcasts and even scientific journals, it's kind of scary to look over the precipice about what happens when we get another political shift and then public health is really held accountable. What's going to happen? Is the right simply going to say, okay, now we want access to those resources? Is the right going to sell out? I mean, those in power. We want access to that easy pharma money, or are they going to stay true to their core principles? And if they stay true to their core principles, there's a lot of work to do to structure science with integrity in the United States. It's gone. It's absolutely gone. There's no integrity. The public health is untrustworthy. People have to understand that what happened was in the 1970s, the prevention paradigm infiltrated the CDC. The CDC used to be pro-treatment against infectious diseases. And then with the vaccine paradigm taking off, that mindset, they literally kicked people out of the CDC that would tolerate discussions in science and advocated for treatments of things like measles with vitamin A. They literally resigned them out, okay, and waited until they retired. So this prevention paradigm took hold in pediatrics big time, because that's where most of the money came from for pediatrics for decades. And then now it's taken hold through COVID of almost all of allopathy. There's in some conservative states, you can get ivermectin in a hospital. That's incredible. Why is that incredible? It shouldn't be a big deal to get a drug that we know the mechanism of action. It blocks the virus entry. We see the population level data. We see the studies. We see the meta-analysis, and the lamestream scientific outlets warp and twist the specific information on ivermectin studies, because there was one flawed study that made it into a meta-analysis, as if the rest of the studies don't matter, right? Well, that's not science. They're not doing science. We knew since the reproducibility crisis came to a head that they weren't doing science. We knew the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine, from their former editors-in-chief. After they resigned, they came out and said, that is a magazine that publishes nothing but commercials for pharma. It's not science. When you read a study, it's a commercial for pharma. If the former editors-in-chief told us this, then what? And what is pharma doing to the world? When 1/4 of all of the surface waters in the world that are studied have environmental risks or health risks caused by pharmaceutical products from the waste stream from humans. What are we doing chemically to this planet and every living thing in the planet, including ourselves? Right? This is a juggernaut. And it's all the chemists, the ancient American Chemical Society with their waste products from petroleum. I'm sure you're very well aware of the story, the drug story, and the Rockefellers and all of that. I don't tend to talk about that because that to me is just a matter of historical fact that we've got some bad actors out there that are profiting on waste. They put it in our biosludge, and now we're seeing these forever chemicals. They put biosludge on farms. There's a family up here in Michigan. I moved to Michigan since we last talked, by the way. They have a farm, and it was organic. It was labeled organic because they hadn't used pesticide. They, in 10 years or something, they've qualified. But then they got their soil tested for PFAS. They have huge levels of PFAS because the previous owner of the land fertilized with biosludge. Well, biosludge wasn't just human waste; it was all kinds of waste, and this killing of the small American farmer by making their soil toxic with biosludge leaves us with what? Big pharma, big pharma with an F. Right? It's consolidation. Everybody, a few people are going to own. The 1% are going to become the 0.1% or then the 0.001%. And, what do we have? Massively powerful people. But the good news is that especially the Canadian truckers, of course, and these trucker movements, everything happening all around the world, that the right people are waking up. The right people are waking up at this point in time. And we're not going to have this oligarchy much longer. They can buy bad actors, but those bad actors, like Trudeau, are going to have to be openly bad. It's his call for this police state in Canada that he's saying, which is not going to fly. The civil liberties people up there in Canada are saying it doesn't meet the standard, so it'll be challenged in court. And anybody that's harmed by the Canadian government, by Trudeau's action, by his power seizure here, will get their recourse. But it's almost like I think we're seeing the death throes of what the old Western culture and this new Western culture that has the core features of the vestiges of the Constitution, human rights, individual rights and liberties. And I think that will survive. But the future is definitely daunting and scary, and I feel bad for anybody that was born in 1999 or later. Because how do you make sense out of any of this? Right? It's almost like the 1920s, in Germany. How do you make sense out of the fact that they went through this horrific cultural shock and then into an era of kind of relative depravities, and because everyone was spending borrowed money in the Weimar Republic, and well, that's where the big parties come from. Well, then what are we doing now in the United States? And it's intentional. It'll break the back of the United States for decades. And the other thing is, people should understand that the party's over in the United States when it comes to cheap oil, right? People need to understand that the reason why we went to war in Iraq was so we could have 2 decades of a party on cheap oil that was somebody else's oil. That's why we went to war in Iraq. Well, that party's over. We have no other countries that we can invade unless we go free Canada and get their oil shale, their shale oil. We have to go over to Canada and free Canada from this tyrannical Trudeau. And it's really funny because when I was in Pittsburgh, there was a radio talk show guy named Hansberger. He's dead now, but this was 1994 or so, something like that. And there was this huge debate over whether America should invade other countries. Are we protecting our interests, or are we just doing it for resources? And my master's thesis advisor, Paul Colombo, wrote the book Fates of Nations. And in the book Fates of Nations, he argued, it's a bit like Jared Diamond's book on guns and steel, but in Fates of Nation, Paul outlined very well that every war is an ecological war over some resources, either over water or energy or access to a coastline, with Russia wanting their the pipeline to the coast in Ukraine. And so when I was in Pittsburgh, this ultra conservative radio excuse me talk show person was making the point about how it's okay, we should go into Iraq and we should take the oil because we need it. It's ours. We have the power to do it. Might makes right. He was just brazen about it. And This is before the uranium memo came out, specifically on how the fraudulent memo that Iraq was trying to seek uranium ore from Nigeria. Anyways, so this guy, I called up on the talk show and on his radio show, and I said, well, listen, there's all this shale oil over in Canada. We run out of Iraqi oil. Should we invade Canada and take their shale oil? He said, yes. He was a proponent of oil addiction way back then. So, I mean, those are the things that I've been thinking about, Ricky. Thanks for asking. How about you? Who have you had on lately?
Well, but before we get, I have a couple things you hit on that I think are really fascinating. Something I haven't thought about that I think is really fascinating. I haven't thought about it from the perspective that you kind of mentioned, or was this idea that some good might come out of all this, because I think a appreciation for some of the founding principles of this country, like liberty and all this stuff, like it was kind of neglected or taken for granted. And now we realize how important that is. And like just the philosophy of the founding fathers on how a country should work, and what is important to try to prevent future tyrannies. Like that's all stuff that we kind of took for granted, and things have kind of got out of hand. And now like this has put a new focus on it, where it's like, okay, now it's like the system's corrupt. We went way too far in regards to we're too far from the vision of the founding fathers. And I think now people are reanalyzing, like, okay, what is this country founded on, and what are the principles that are important to us to make sure that we can prevent tyranny. So I think that is interesting, because that might be a optimistic way of looking at everything. And the new normal, the Great Reset, doesn't have to be the shitty worldview of the World Economic Forum. It could be a appreciation for those principles, and maybe the population won't take that for granted, because I think it almost sometimes takes something like this for people to wake up. It's like, if there's, like I've said this a billion times on the show, when there's corruption going on and all this stuff going on all over the world, it's like we talked about, I've had plenty of guests in the past, like the attorney from Dark Waters, who was, I think RFK was on, also one of the attorneys on that DuPont lawsuit with the, what's it called, like C4 or whatever it was, that Teflon that was harming people, like a huge lawsuit. Had, the attorney on my show, didn't do that well. Like it didn't get any more downloads. And I'm like, this is a huge deal. So it's like all these things are going on, and people are just like, well, I get to go out to eat, and I get to bring my kids to school, and I get to, do whatever I enjoy doing. It's, who cares that there's corruption over there, and the lobbyists are paying off politicians over there. And it's like, finally it's gone. I mean, and I'm not saying like I'm not presenting it like it's a good thing, but at least it's gotten everybody's attention, where it's like, you can't ignore this forever, because the polluted, corrupt system will eventually, and maybe it's too late by then, but eventually it will become so corrupt, and the system will be so broken that it will affect you. And by then it might be too late to backtrack or fix it. So that is a interesting way of looking at it. Another thing is the individualism. You hear a lot of people in the past. I've had guests on, like James Corbett, who talked about the collective, and how they're trying to propose this idea of how important the collective is. It's all about the collective, and I always thought about, I'm like, well, I'm like, is that really a bad thing to care about our name? And then you realize, like, okay, so this is where it could go really bad, because what happens is everybody should be doing things for the greater good that the government decides is the greater good we should all be working towards. And then our individual right to pursue happiness or live our lives, it just goes out the window. And so that's interesting too, so there's, and then recently and the other thing, and I'd love to get your opinion on this, because obviously Joe Rogan's been in the news a lot and all this stuff. One thing that I hope Joe Rogan and a lot of people like Jimmy Dore and many others who have been attacked for just being out for just questioning things. I hope they think twice before labeling somebody a conspiracy theorist because of the same type of a character assassination. I hope everybody who's been character assassinated and by just questioning something and then completely misrepresented it, on newspapers and articles and all this stuff, I hope they don't make the same mistake when hearing that RFK Jr. is an anti-vaxxer or Del Bigtree is an anti-vaxxer, and they accept these labels that the mainstream media put on them and realize, like, okay, the same way they can paint this picture that they're an anti-vaxxer, or a Dr. Wakefield, who's probably one of the most famous, and nobody, I've had him on the show in the past. Like, I mean, I feel so bad for that guy, because I remember the first time I looked into his story and I'm like, he's not an anti-vaxxer at all. Like, that's
Absolutely right.
yeah, and then, but yet he was like the most commonly doctor that people would bring up as an anti-vaxxer, and let's say that he's been discredited and all this stuff, and nobody knew his story and nobody knew how he got that label. So I hope people realize, like, even people who aren't these things, the media does a really good job of just putting these labels on them, and when you look into them, you're like, oh no, they're actually an open-minded person who has well thought out ideas and opinions. And so I and then I guess the last thing I want to mention, because I want to get your opinion on this. Because you mentioned this, do you think that, because I've heard a lot of doctors and a lot of people in the science world talk about how the public has lost their trust in science. I'm curious if you think that there's been a loss of public trust, or has all this kind of exposed the flaws in science and how it can be easily manipulated?
Right. So starting with the science part, specifically what people have lost trust in is not science, right? If I do a study and I throw away the results because I don't like it, I reanalyze the data and I throw away those results because I don't like the results, and I do it over and over again, something called p-hacking, until I get the results that I want, I'm not doing science, and the public should lose trust in that process. I don't know what it's called. I've called it science-like activities, right? So it's very important. It's called pseudoscience, it's called fake science, it's called fraud. It's very important that people understand why I created Unbreaking Science, the podcast that I have, why I created the university, IPAC EDU, to teach people what proper science is, and what logic and reason are, and how to use them, and the fundamentals of things like biology and virology and immunology, fundamentals, right? So that the oligarchy can't say, whoa, follow the science, we're doing the science over here. It's like, let me give you an analogy, what it feels like when somebody says, well, we don't trust science anymore, right? Let's imagine that, so what's your favorite sport?
I would say soccer and basketball are my two favorite.
Okay. So let's say that there was a huge controversy in American football, and that players are being paid off to throw games to just shave off enough of their performance so that a certain game would go a certain way. And then I said, soccer. I don't trust soccer anymore. That's what it sounds like to me, right? When somebody says, the public doesn't trust science, because those were not scientists. Those were people that were minding the narrative, hiding the bodies at the CDC of the past fraud that they did. And so simply because someone has a PhD and publishes in a so-called scientific journal doesn't make them a scientist. What makes them a scientist is that each and every day and each and every study that they do, they refuse to drink from the teat of fraud. It's very simple. It's very simple, and there's a demarcation. There's an actual very simple demarcation laid out by Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, that says, hey, if you're testing a hypothesis with a critical test, and you might reject your own favored pet hypothesis, you're doing science. If you're not testing your hypothesis with a critical test and putting it at risk, you're not doing science. It's a very famous demarcation. And so if I'm actually making sure that my favorite hypothesis survives to the end of my study by fraudulently manipulating my data, then I'm basically operating a fudge factory or something, a data fudge factory. I'm not doing science. And so, the public should have, it's impossible to lose faith in science, if you will, faith in science. It's impossible to lose trust in science, because science is a process, is a way of knowing. And when it's done properly, you always get a useful result. You either learned something was yes or something was no. right? Or maybe you learn that the answer is maybe. That's still useful sometimes. But when you fraudulently cook the data, then those people should be kicked out. They should be resigned. They should be retired. Maybe they should be arrested. I don't know. The point is that I don't have the political solution to that. In terms of Rogan and Jimmy Dore and other large, highly visible voices, there's another guy, John Campbell too in the UK, right? So Dr. John Campbell. I just wrote on my Substack Popular Rationalism, this guy should be given an award. He should be given an honorary PhD. He should be given an honorary MD. He should be given an honorary everything. And I'm being attacked by my own loving readers by saying, no, he's pro-vaccine. He thinks everybody in Hong Kong should get vaccinated. Well, he's on a journey. He's on a learning curve. I was on that learning curve, right? Joe Rogan definitely was on a learning curve. And I think, you probably are aware, most people listening will be aware that it's just the next logical thing that happens to you once you're attacked. And I think you're right, having been attacked. The next thing that happens is they try it on as a badge of honor and it fits. If the bad guys are attacking you, then you're wearing it as a badge of honor, right? Now, I'm not anti-vaccine. I think that there are approaches towards vaccination. But if you go read my Wikipedia article, somebody put up a Wikipedia article. It's simply like a one-sentence hit job about some testimony that I gave in the vaccine court. It's a quote from a special master, so that other lawyers can find it and then use that if I show up as an expert somewhere else. So the reputation of currency, and I'm a long-time thinker. I think in terms of not just years, but decades and hundreds of years in culture and evolution and history. So what's going to happen is that we've empowered this culture of reputation to the point where itself is more valuable than money, right? Your reputation is more valuable than money, because without a solid reputation by whatever culture is saying this is how you should act, look, and feel, you're non-viable. What does it mean to be non-viable? I was invited by a journal to be an editor on a special volume, Frontiers in Genetics. And they met with me and we had a Zoom call about doing a special volume where I was the editor and I would invite the other editors, invite the authors, do peer review on genetics, just any topic in genetics I felt like. And I was really excited about it because I'm doing all this environmental science. I'm teaching environmental science. I'm writing articles about how nobody sufficiently studies synergistic toxicity from different chemicals, from medicine and from the environment, from pollution. And like you mentioned, our cookware. And there's so much to do. And part of that, I'm convinced, has a genetic component. There are people that are higher risk of specific kinds of toxins and toxins in general. So I'm all excited about it. And I go to get the email this morning and they say, oh, sorry, we found that one of your papers was retracted. So our policy is that we're not going to have you as an editor. I'm sorry. So that's what it means to become non-viable. I wrote back to them and I said, this is a very short-term thinking on your part, but I'm sorry. It's nice meeting you. Goodbye. No hard feelings, because they have policy is policy after all, right? Got to follow the policy. In the long term, this currency of reputation will, and I don't know if people can actually relate to this thought. This is kind of far out there. Imagine a world where your reputation doesn't matter, and people that try to take you down on the basis of reputation are seen as, as the same way we look at child molesters now, right? If you actually attack somebody on the basis of just their reputation, not on the basis of, hey, I was at the accident, that's car T-boned this, I'm giving a witness, exactly what happened, and no judgment call, that's a bad person. No, maybe it was a good person. Maybe he was trying to save somebody's life by trying to get to, to the hospital on time. Who the hell knows what went through, right? But there are people who just make a living off of this, consuming other people's reputation. And that's kind of gross and disgusting. We used to call it yellow journalism, right? And so, like you said, you feel bad for Dr. Wakefield. I used to joke with him how, in public, large talks and large audiences, how I don't feel bad for Andy. He's got a supermodel for a girlfriend, but subsequently broke up or whatever. But the point is, why is reputation so much more important than the actual product that you produce. Right? What are you producing? You're producing valid information, considered thought, detailed analysis. It's incredibly valuable for people who are struggling to find their way through. Right? Reputation is temporary. Reputation is plastic by definition. You can regain your reputation. You can become rehabilitated. But if you're given this anti-vax thing, the reason why it sticks forever is because they needed a whipping boy for this. So they got Andy to be the whipping boy. We're going to pull him out every time something comes up that's controversial about vaccines. It was intentional, and they knew it. And Mary Holland's written a great piece covering the history of Andy Wakefield. And it talks about how his co-author was completely exonerated. And Andy would have been exonerated if he didn't run out of financial money, money to. But one of the things that I did want to mention to people is that scientists understand the relationships about what makes you act a certain way. When it comes to, are you going to get into a bar fight? Are you going to help a little old lady across the street? What makes you act a certain way? And some of it's genetic. Our propensity, our ability to do certain acts is genetic, but most of it's cultural. And so these things are correlated. But right now we're sitting on a precipice where we're going to go one way or the other. We're going to go totalitarian, or we're going to go resurgence of liberty and freedom and appreciation, as you said, which I'm glad you pointed it out that way. And you also pointed out that, hey, why do people just satisfy themselves? I get to go out to dinner. I get to see my kid play a ball game. The technical term in the psychological literature for that deals with whether or not a person feels that they are self-sacrificing. Am I losing something, that whether it's important to me or not? And this predates human civilization. This predates the human species. If you take a baboon, an orangutan, take an orangutan, and you give an orangutan or a chimpanzee a grape, that's a really super treat, right? And if you give them something like a vegetable, they'll eat it. And if so, you have two co-equal, otherwise just the same apes, right, in a cage, and you give them fruit, vegetable, you give them the carrot, give them the fruit, they'll both eat it, right? And everything's fine. They'll keep eating it until they're hungry, until their hunger is gone. But then if one ape sees you give a grape to the other ape, and then you hand that other ape a vegetable, they'll protest. They're losing something. That guy over there got a grape. They'll throw their vegetable on the ground. They won't eat it. They'll throw a temper tantrum. This predates the origin of our species on this planet. And so what people are dealing with, this is why examining your life is so important. What are your priorities? Live a conscious, purposeful life. Make your decisions knowing that you have made a path for yourself, because no one else is making a path for you. You're the only person. You are the captain of your own ship. And it's not until somebody comes along and says, I've got the answer, follow me, and then you follow them. Well, that's your responsibility still. You can't give up on your personal responsibility. If you acquiesce to the tribe and you just follow along with the group, you're still responsible. We know this. We learned that the hard way. But the decision to take charge of your own life is something that is so fundamentally important, because this problem of perceived self-sacrifice makes things worse, right? So there's no stress in life. Everyone's perceived stress is a certain amount of perceived stress in their life. But you can negatively impact your cognitive function if you're too stressed out. Imagine, being in a room where there's 7 different televisions playing and there's symbols crashing and you're trying to read a sentence. You want to be able to read the sentence. So with stress and distractions and self-sacrifice, it can affect your cognitive function, and all of that can lead to depression. The brain tries to survive by literally shutting down executive function, literally shutting down social function. So we understand this scientifically. And then that depression makes pain, all of those factors contribute to making pain worse. So if you do get hurt, you can't tolerate that self-injury. right? And then you get in a relationship and you lose your loved one. The pain from loss of that loved one in that setting is a lot more than the pain of I just got a promotion at work. I just bought myself a new car. You're not feeling self-sacrifice. So this idea of, and it's really at the core of all political and economic theory, whether or not a person feels like they're getting the same amount or what's due to them, not just from I'm entitled to it, but am I getting less than someone for no particular reason? Is there an injustice here? And the answer to that, and I'm sure you figured this out because you're a musician, you've gone through this, is just let go of materialism. Now, what does that mean? I have a car. Am I a materialist? No, because I have a Mazda 5. Okay, every time I go somewhere, I talk about my Maserati. I'm at the shop. I'm like, hey, guys, is my Maserati ready? They love it. They love it because finally here's somebody that they know they're going to relate to me on something other than, did you scratch? Did you put your foot on my car and you left an imprint, right, on the carpet. You got to get somebody in here and clean this up right now. This is my car, right? I'm not that guy. I'm the guy that says, hey, you guys, my Maserati ready? And I don't care if there's shit all over my car. I really don't. It doesn't mean I don't care for my car. I do care for my car because it gets me places. But I don't allow material goods to be my identity. And anybody who really has a favorite thing that means a lot, sentimental because their grandfather or grandmother, whatever, sentimental, that's a different category. That's a symbolic representation of a relationship with a human being. That's something completely different. But the knowing understanding what path you are on, when you start saying this is an injustice because someone has more than I have, and that by definition means that it's an injustice, is the whole basis of the Great Reset. And that is going to lead to things like perceived stress, increased perceived stress, loss of cognitive function, depression, and pain. That's what the Great Reset's going to bring to people that drink from that particular bottle of Kool-Aid. So we know this, and so the answer to this is to study this, I think, scientifically and talk about it with the principles and precepts. And you know who Mark McDonald is? He's a psychologist who's got a great book. I forget the name of this book, but he was the origin of the mass formation psychosis idea. Right? Robert Woolman popularized that. Well, he's coming to IPAC EDU. I just signed a contract, and he's going to teach a course, How Not to Be Fooled. Right? So we're dealing with the biology of neurology, neurobiology in a different course. We're dealing with immunology in one course, environmental toxicology in another course, and the wellness of the human mind and sociological and political things, but not with any particular agenda. The agenda, no political agenda. I'm not left, I'm not right. I simply want to empower the public. Simply want to empower the public so that they stand on a firm ground on how to use their brain. That's basically what we're doing. And the students love it. I had a student, there were 3 lectures into a particular course that we're teaching. They wrote to me and said, he's like 30 or 40 years old. Said, I've been waiting for this institution for my entire life. Where have you been? It's a life changing for some people because you don't have to worry about the pressure of a college degree. You don't have to worry about grades. You just go and learn the material, right? We're going to present you with a bona fide, basic, valid biology, let's say, or psychology, whatever course you're taking. And what you do with it's up to you, right? And the prices are incredibly low. It's like $180 a course, and you get 15 lectures. So that fits anyone's budget. But the mission of this is to empower the public to stand up against that oligarchy. So that the technocrats will think they can no longer think their way around you, right? Because in part, I can't be everywhere at once, right? There was a time for 2 years straight, I traveled everywhere, and I was testifying all these state capitals. And it ground on my reputation, which by now people have figured out I really don't care about. I know who I am. People can say anything about me, right? I've got story after story after story where I have been confronted by people. Ricky, if you want to know me, there was some kids that were being abused in a house that was attached to mine when I was an undergraduate in SUNY Oswego. They were allowed to cry throughout the night. They would just cry and cry and cry and cry. I don't know if they were autistic or something, but they weren't being consoled or taken care of. And I was concerned, and I tried to talk with the parents about it, and they just told me to F off. And he was an alcoholic, and she was, not well. Let's just put it that way. Well, I ended up calling Child Protective Services, and that was a big, big decision. It took me a long time to do that. I couldn't see these kids doing this anymore. I didn't know what else was going on. When the police showed up, they said, "Are they home?" I said, "No, they're not home." "Okay, good. We can talk to you. We have chased this woman through 5 counties. Okay, they keep moving her in the family because the neighbors can't put up with this, right? There's something wrong, but the kids are not being hurt. Okay, they're just neglected. They're not really, there's no physical abuse as far as we can tell, no sexual abuse as far as we can tell." I'm like, "Okay." He goes, "Well, you have the right to press charges or not press charges. That's what the law was." And I said, "Well, based on what you told me, there's no reason to press charges, but I am gonna want you to talk to them and let them know that there's a problem, that you're still watching them, and that they should probably seek some counseling and figure out how to be better parents or something." And so that was a mistake, because the next day, the guy that lived in the apartment behind me with his wife came to my door. My wife at the time and my best friend Alan were there. Oh, she wasn't my wife yet; we weren't married. But my best friend Alan were in the apartment, and I told him to go hide in the basement because this guy had a frying pan in his hand, and he was banging on the door, bang, 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 bang. "Let me in! I'm gonna bash you see this frying pan? I'm gonna bash your head in with this frying pan." Okay. And I said, "Oh," his name was Cecil or something like that. I go, "Cecil, you're not going to hit me in the head with a frying pan. It's just not going to happen." He goes, "That's only because you're hiding behind that door. Open this door and I'll show you what to do with this frying pan. You're trying to get my kids taken away from me." And I go, "I'm telling you, Cecil, you're not going to hit me with a frying pan whether the door is open or closed." I go, "Do you drink coffee?" He didn't know what to make of that. He gave me this one of these looks, right? And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "Why don't you come on upstairs? We'll give you a cup of coffee. Let's sit down and talk." "Really?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So I open the door. He starts to walk in with the frying pan. I turned around. I turned my back on the man. And as I'm walking away, I said to him, "Probably want to leave the frying pan on the porch." Okay. He put it on the frying, went upstairs, made a pot of coffee, sat down. I treat him like a human being. I poured him his coffee. "You take milk? You take sugar? What do you do? Cream?" Okay. Sat down with this guy. And as soon as he took his first cup of coffee, he goes, "Man, it's not me. She's crazy." Okay, he just threw his wife right under the bus, right? Like, okay. So it is possible in extreme conflict to diffuse real threats simply by addressing the human being in front of you. It is absolutely possible. And I've done this in many, many settings. I've done it with people. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but there's somebody very famous in the vaccine risk aware movement, very famous in the vaccine risk movement, that was screaming his full head off at me on the phone. I'm not going to tell you who. Screaming over a slight oversight on my part. It was an honest mistake that I made. And I just kept complimenting him how brilliant he was. Just how, that thing that you just did, I wish I could tell you the whole story. I'll tell you offline. That thing that you just did was so brilliant, man. It's just freaking awesome. Yeah, no, seriously, you should, I just kept complimenting him. No matter what he says, coming at me, "I don't care about that. You're not listening to me. You can't do this, I'm like, "But you don't understand. I am so honored." And I just kept at it to the point where he knew I was sincere or crazy or both. And the conversation ended with him promising me he was going to buy me a sandwich when I came to his town. So we're still friends and work together to this day. The point is, we're not automatons. As you're talking about with Dr. Rose earlier, Dr. Jessica Rose, she has breadth because she has experienced life many different ways, right? If you want to, you can try, microdosing psilocybin. You can go to ayahuasca. You can do what you want to do to try to expand your brain. But if you want to learn something, try another language or learn an instrument or write a song. Or go back to the poetry that you abandoned 20 years ago. Go back to it. Express yourself. That's the important thing. Express yourself and find out who you are and make a map for your own life. Because if you don't make a map for your own life, other people will. And when you acquiesce, you've made that decision. You're still responsible for the outcome. So people that acquiesce to tyranny, and they're responsible for that acquiescence, okay? Which is the inverse of the argument that we must stand up to tyranny. No, that's your conclusion. You have a choice in the face of tyranny to stand up for it, stand up against it, and chart your own path and take your own path of your life in your own hands, or to acquiesce. And that's your choice. So, it's really important that people understand that even without democracy, sorry about the hair thing, just went crazy, but hang on, even without democracy, there's choice in society about what will tolerate it. In New Zealand, when they said New Zealand, the government started playing things like the Macarena. They started playing the Macarena to the protesters, the truckers, the trucking protesters, expecting that they were going to then break the individualism in the group and get everybody to start doing the Macarena, right? They didn't. They started playing "We're Not Going to Take It" back at them instead of doing the Macarena, right? And that's a really good thing to do, because if the group starts doing a group dance, then okay, we got them where we want them, right? Because now they're acting in unison, and now we're going to say, okay, this has been fun. Now it's time everybody leave. And they probably would have, but they didn't. They said, no, we're not going to do your stupid little dance. We're going to go. Nothing's wrong with the Macarena dance, but so
I do prefer Twisted Sister. I do. That's so much that you said is so fascinating. I mean, one thing about stress, and that's one of the reasons why I've been trying to do this full time for so long, and I've gotten a little bit more serious with trying to pursue that in the last couple of years, because as much as I want to be able to like balance everything, the stresses of a full-time job and then trying to do this, it without a doubt affects my cognitive ability to like be engaged, because when you're in a conversation for a long period of time, it's like you want to be focused on what they're saying and where the conversation's taking you. And when you have all these stresses in the background of like, bills and priorities and maybe things that need to get done for work, like sometimes it's really hard to be in the now, so it's so important to find something that you love that can help you reset and get away from all those things. Like you said, I know a lot of people who are micro dosing. I know people who do the Wim Hof method, the breathing method, or some type of meditation, whatever hobby it may be, playing music, art, poetry, like you said, all those things, like you're focused on that one thing. But also I think that when you're being creative, you're in a way you're looking you're looking inside, right? You're tapping into some emotion, something, maybe some trauma, and maybe you're organizing it, or you're figuring it out, or you're at least just acknowledging that it's present, and then that's the first steps of kind of figuring it out and resolving it. There's this book, Mind Over Back Pain. Are you familiar with that book?
No.
By Dr. John Sorno? I think he passed away recently, but I'll get you the name of the full name of the book is Mind Over Back Pain, a radically new approach to diagnose and treatment of back pain. And what it was he was one of the really well-known leading surgeon in like backs, and he was looking at patients who had really bad backs and didn't have a lot of pain, and then patients who had not so bad backs and would say that they had a lot of pain. So he's like, none of this is really making sense. And as time went on, he started asking questions and kind of reanalyzing why this could be. And he came to the conclusion that, and this was after like just asking a couple questions to the patients. It's like, okay, well, your back doesn't look that bad, but you're saying you have a lot of pain. Like, what's going on in your personal life? And come to find out that what he learned was it was a lot of mental stress and mental pain and emotional pain that was making the physical pain worse. And I forget what percentage it is, but like some huge percentage of patients, just by explaining this to him, left his office feeling better. And the mind body is connected. Mentally when you feel good, physically you feel good, and vice versa. And obviously the opposite is true too. Mentally when you feel like crap, physically you feel like crap. And the placebo effect does exist. We understand that mentally, if there's so many studies, like there's studies with like sleep, right? They'll tell you that you got 8 hours of sleep and you really didn't, and you feel great, or you got less sleep than you really did, and you feel
Right.
and it's all fabricated and it's all mental. Mentality is so important, if it's sports, if it's just whatever it may be, like so much of it's mental. Like one of my favorite sayings, you change the way you look at things, what you look at changes, because it's so true. You could look at something as in a negative manner, or you can look at it in a positive manner and be like, okay, this is a challenge. This is I've said this on show before when I had Dr. Sean Baker on, who's kind of like one of the leading faces or most popular faces in the carnivore diet world. I did the carnivore diet for like 2-3 weeks. Actually, I did it for 2 weeks. Then I enjoyed the way I felt and looked. So I did it for a third week. And I'm like, worst case scenario, this has become a mental exercise. And what I'll get from this, outside of the diet, what I'm going to get from this is I'm going to understand how to push myself through something, how to do something that maybe I don't feel like doing, but I know the outcome is something I'm pursuing and is important and it's helpful. And it's just a mental discipline exercise. And so many of us need those things. When I sometimes need a day off from the gym, I'm like, okay, am I really sore and should I take today off, or am I finding every reason not to go to the gym today? So I'll go and have a light workout or maybe just stretch and whatever. But just going makes me feel better because I'm like, okay, I fought procrastination. I fought all these negative feelings and things that were gonna lead me down the road of feeling guilty about not going. And I, and then this is gonna make me mentally stronger for the next hurdle in life. And so I think all that is so important. And I think that's also why, unfortunately, a lot of musicians who I'm very disappointed in, who end up drinking the Kool-Aid in regards to the whole COVID thing. I think a lot of artists, and I've talked to Dr. Jessica Rose about this because she also is a musician, and when you're an artist, you're one of the things that you're probably more in touch with than maybe somebody who's not is your emotions, right? And you connect with other people emotionally, and maybe a little more than the average person. So I think when you get artists or people who are more artistic, then it's easier to convince them that, hey, let's do this for everybody. You should feel bad for everybody. And you should, and we're trying to help everybody. And this is our purpose. This is what we're trying to accomplish. And those capitalistic people who want to open the economy because they're worried about money and they're not worried about people, they're the bad people. And I think that's why it's so easy to convince them that capitalists are the root of all evil, because you think, oh, government's not a for-profit industry. It's a it's there to protect us and help us when needed. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard sometimes to kind of wake people up who are artists, or how they're so easily tricked into those things. But that's why I love what you're doing, because and it reminds me a lot of who Richard Grove is from Grand Theft World. He has a podcast, Grand Theft World. He also has a course called Autonomy, and he's done a bunch of stuff in the past. He's a awesome guy. Very similar type of course in regards to just teaching people stuff and not really telling you what to do with it, but just helping you pursue what you want and teaching critical thinking skills and how to think for yourself and expand on whatever things you like or talents you may have. And it sounds silly, but that's something that sometimes we need, because the school systems have kind of just taught us to regurgitate information and not question it, not question authority. I think that's why the vaccine debate, I've said this before on the show, that for some reason we could talk about any prescription drug on the market. We could talk about big pharma. We could talk about FDA, CDC, all of them in a negative light, and talk about corruption in the industries or in that business world. And people would be like, yeah, that's believable. Yeah, I think so. And then you talk about vaccines, and it's like, no, it's like all of a sudden they look at these entities like they're moral, moral things. And I think a lot of that is conditioning, because at such a young age, you tell people like vaccines have saved us from polio, vaccines have, and then every kid is getting vaccinated and everybody is fine. Look at all these people get vaccinated, and you don't even think about it. So many parents just vaccinate their kids because that's what you do. And
Right.
and that's why even with the COVID vaccine, you saw how some of that conditioning was exposed a little bit, because I know people who are like, dude, because in Massachusetts, they for a short period of time, and I think it was actually ICANN, Del Bigtree's group, that end up suing Massachusetts and removing this mandate. But they had a mandate for when they opened schools again for the flu vaccine, which had nothing to do with COVID, but they just threw that mandate out of nowhere. And I knew so many parents that I talked to, they're like, what's up with the flu vaccine? Why should that be mandated to go back to school? We're not even fighting the flu. How does that make any sense? And I looked at them and I'm just like, you do realize like that's just one of many vaccines that probably aren't necessary for your kids to go to school. Like, why is this one? But it's like all the other ones at such a young age you accept, and it's just a way of life, and it's just something you accept that you don't even question it. And it shows how you can condition a generation to think something is normal, and then it becomes normal. And then it's really hard to wake people up that like, hey, you know what, like the flu vaccine is just one of many vaccines that your kid has to take to go to school. Like, why are you looking at this one from a different light? And it's like, okay, because this is new, and the other ones have been conditioned in your life and your worldview to be acceptable. That's the thing. Even the vaccine conversation, I don't like the word anti-vaxxer. I'm just like, listen, there's science can be wrong. Science can harm people sometimes, maybe unintentionally. Maybe
Right.
there are things out there that are helpful for some, harmful for others. I've used this analogy a bunch of times, this metaphor of if you give every kid in the world peanut butter, some kids are going to die. It doesn't mean that peanut butter is necessarily dangerous to everybody, but it also doesn't mean it's safe for everybody. And that's kind of the way we have to look at it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to this idea that musicians, can relate to others on the call for the common good. All humanity understands, a reasonable amount of self-sacrifice, a reasonable amount of giving of yourself for the betterment of others, and other people really just thrill and enjoy in, giving till it hurts. That's where they come from. But the mindset that people understand as happiness is really that flow state that musicians and painters and artists know about, where you're so focused on what you're doing, everything else is a lesser of a priority, not in a bad way, just I get to do this now, like you said, I want to do this full time. And you get in that flow state, and that flow state comes with a clear set of goals and purposes. This is what allows you to get into flow state. It comes with the ability to get feedback right away. You can't enter that kind of like happy flow state unless you're getting some kind of feedback, even if you're a painter focused 100% on the canvas, a musician jamming with a bunch of friends, right? And that feedback is literally feedback. You're creating sound, it's coming back to you, you're enjoying how it sounds together, and then the crowd's reaction. And then, of course, there really needs to be a decent balance between your abilities and what you're trying to do to enter that flow state. If those three conditions are met, then you can enter the flow state. But that flow state's not unique to musicians. It also happens to a mom who's got 3 kids running around the house. She's got this in the oven. She's doing the laundry over here. She's just changed them. They all fell down for a nap. She knows this one's going to wake up first, so she's got to get this phone call in first. She's got to call the bank. Blah, blah, blah. Those people enter that same flow state of happiness. They're just not seeking it out as an escape from their life. And so the key to happiness is to recognizing that what you're trying to escape might be a place where you can find a flow state, right? And one of the keys to happiness is literally just to choose to make that what you're going to be happy about, what you're going to value, because values are subjective. And when it comes to vaccines, okay, so conversation I had with my kids' chemistry high school teacher, they're now both in college. I had lunch with them and we sat down just to talk science and so on. And I had this new book, Cures versus Profits, and I gave him this book, Cures versus Profits. And he goes, "What's it about?" I said, "Well, it's about how pharma charges too much money for drugs in the United States because they can, about how pharma, screws with the science, plays with the science on drugs, and does this and does this, does this." And he goes, "Oh, I know all about this because my wife, she used to work, she's a pharmacist. And she would come home and she actually had to quit because of all the corruption, and they were selling just the drugs that were most profitable." And so we went down this list of like 10 topics that we agreed on. And topic after topic after topic after topic. He's like, "Yeah." And we're totally vibing with me on it. And then I go, "By the way, there is a chapter on vaccines in there." He goes, "Nah, they wouldn't do that." It's like this shield women. So what that is called is a taboo. And sociologically, it's a taboo where a cultural norm or moire comes with enforcement. Because you don't have culture without enforcement. It doesn't exist. You have to have some form of enforcement for some emergent or new or sustained culture. And the enforcement is, I'm a bad person if I'm against vaccines, because those people over there are going to say that I'm a bad person. I might not understand all the science of vaccines or how they're studied, but I know that everybody's saying that they're good. Everybody's saying that they're good. So this kind of like mantra, this mob mentality, is exactly the mass psychosis that Malone and McDonald have been talking about in McCullough, whereby you're not allowed to think outside the box because you don't allow yourself to think outside the box. You're afraid. You dare not go there. And we can all think about scenes in movies where a person, the answer's right in front of them, but they won't reach over that line and get the key, right? They just won't do it. We can all think about this. And when it's captured in film, it's understandable because we can relate to it so fundamentally. So what are the restrictions that we're placing on our lives based on fallacies and falsehoods that are enforced by bullying, this form of bullying, really? And if you think about how we taught an entire generation of kids that bullying is wrong. My kids grew up, it was part of the curriculum. It was codified in the curriculum. Bullying is just wrong. Don't do it. And those are the same people that are now bullying. Right? They're part of the bullying. They will participate in bullying of others. And part of that is because you don't know where you are in the pecking order unless there's somebody lower than you. There is that aspect of, am I the same as, equal to, or less than? Where do I sit? Am I the alpha or the omega? Nobody wants to be the omega. So this pressure to conform is massive, and the disinformation campaign implemented by the CDC, by the US government, by other governments, is programmed exactly to have that effect. It's intentional. It's not just a byproduct. It's specifically to shut down dissent on the matter. Again, this is why they had to have Wakefield. They had to have a whipping boy. Without that whipping boy, it could be just someone's opinion against another opinion. They had to destroy his career so he couldn't continue to publish articles or opinions or participate in peer review, or God forbid, become an editor of a journal, right? So the mechanisms and the means by which this enforcement of vaccine risk unawareness or vaccine risk denialism, you can read them in the textbook. Go look at how the CIA infiltrated the African American freedom movement, right? It was the equal rights movement. The name of that group's with the berets. It's blanking. What's the name of that group with the black berets in the 1960s?
The Panthers?
Yes, thank you.
Black
Panthers.
Yeah. Oh yeah, they infiltrated all the anti-war movements. I mean, obviously, Edgar Hoover was spying on MLK.
Yeah.
I've done shows on the MLK assassination with Dr. James D. Genio, who also is a advisor to Oliver Stone on his new documentary on the JFK assassination. He has a website called Kennedy's with a S and King, which is all about the assassinations of all of them. And
Yeah.
they've all been linked to CIA, and they all seem to be inside job. Yeah, I mean, it's just that's the thing, is that it's it's hard to wake people up, because it's like they have these blinders that it's like during the Iraq war, it was the right was the bad, obviously the bad guys, because they were the ones who were pushing us into a war. And now it's like the opposite, and it's like you just realize, like, okay, there's like, it doesn't matter who's in power, it doesn't matter what era we're living through. Like, don't trust the media. That there's always going to be CIA and deep state people who are having an effect on the mainstream narrative, and that never changes. And it's not a right versus left thing. And that's kind of the sad part of the COVID thing. It became such a political thing where and I think it was Joe Rogan who said it, and I've repeated it, where wearing a mask became their version of a MAGA hat, where it was like, this, it wasn't about the virus. It was about just like showing my dislike of Trump because he didn't want to wear a mask, and he didn't seem to be
That's right.
taking it serious. He didn't seem to be taking this very serious threat, to the level that they wanted to, because everybody else was saying. And the thing is, they got tricked, because the levels that the media was taking this in regards to fear mongering was because the bigger deal they could make this, the worse Trump would look, because he was trying to open the economy. He talked about, oh, let's open the economy around Easter or whatever, so a lot of it was politically motivated. And then people fell for it, instead of, which is weird, because the left was people that were fighting for the same things I was fighting for a long time, like chemical companies lying, all this stuff, big pharma lying. I mean, just all this stuff that was like, yeah, like, there's big corporations that care more about profit than the public's health. And now all of a sudden, your dislike of a political party or dislike of a politician has completely blurred your vision into being able to see that is the same issue that we're dealing with now. It's not a political issue. Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, these things became, like you said, the political things, where it's like, they demonize it, even though the WHO, they have them as like essential drugs. They've been around forever. I'm not pro pharmaceutical drugs, but they're definitely some of the safer ones on the market and been used for many, many years. And all of a sudden they became dangerous. It's like, whoa, why did they become dangerous all of a sudden? So it's yeah, I mean, it's sad, because it's like but I think you're starting to see things turn around. It's becoming less of a political issue now, when you start seeing athletes that were very caught up in the the protests and the BLM movement and all that type of stuff, now realizing, like, okay, these mandates seem a little too much, because I'm a elite athlete with the best nutritionist, with the best exercise equipment and health in the world. I'm the elite of the elite. I think I'm pretty safe in regards to a virus that is has a 99.9% survival rate, which I ran this through Ryan from Last American Vagabond. He was on the last podcast. I'm curious on your thoughts on, I kind of feel like, so as people know who are listening, like, okay, so you have the coronavirus, and then you have COVID-19, and I feel like they keep saying that people are testing positive for COVID and not coronavirus, because it sounds worse, and it seems like a well thought out plan. Because if you just said, hey, we're stopping the spread of a coronavirus, it sounds like, well, coronavirus has been around forever. You could pick any typical common virus, and you could find it everywhere, and tons of people could test positive for it, and it doesn't mean it's harmful, and we should shut down the world to prevent the spread of it. But they keep saying, like, oh, this person's asymptomatic for COVID. And I'm like, well, isn't COVID the disease that has symptoms? How can you, like, is there my lack of science just making me misunderstand this? Or am I right when I say that doesn't really make sense?
No, you're absolutely right. So it was April 2020 when Deborah Birx made the announcement that unlike other countries, the United States was going to count people who died with COVID as dying from COVID. And at the same time, they also made the determination that PCR positive is the disease, which doesn't make any biological sense or scientific or medical sense at all, because you can have a virus but not have the disease. For instance, we all have, if you've had chickenpox, you have the virus in your body still, but you don't have chickenpox, the disease. And it's very, very important distinction, so much so that since April 2020, I've been working with other scientists like Dr. Singhang Lee to write that book. We published a paper by Dr. Henry Ely in the journal, peer-reviewed journal of Science, Public Health Policy and the Law, where they found that the CDC didn't go through proper channels to change the way that they were doing counting and reporting an assessment of COVID. Now, it sounds all bureaucratic and everything, but it's so core and fundamental that if you said, oh, I tested positive for the SARS-CoV-2 virus or for coronavirus, oh, okay, did you get the disease? That's the conversation that we'd be allowed to have. Oh, I have COVID. Okay, that's it. It's the end of the world. I have COVID. Layering on top of that semantic distinction, which is an important one, is the fact that Dr. Singhang Lee, for instance, found evidence in one of the Pfizer trial data that suggests that perhaps they're suffering from a 90% or worse false positive rate. So a simple PCR test can't tell you that you have the virus if it has a 90% false positive rate. It can tell you that you have a positive PCR test, and then you have to go confirm that with sequencing. And that's why we set up NATEC, NAATEC. It's the Nucleic Acid Assay Technology Evaluation Consortium. And we just funded Dr. Lee to analyze, I think, 50 samples that were PCR positive for the virus. And so he's sequencing them right now. And we're going to find out what his updated false positive rate might be. He's not the first person to do this kind of study, but we have an IRB approved protocol to take clinical samples from people that test positive or negative from PCR and then sequence the same sample or another sample taken at the same time to determine it, because we've accused the CDC of overcounting, right? And true to form, I wrote to the FDA and I said, you're doing it wrong. When you're looking at these PCR tests, you have to have negative samples, and they have to show you that on a negative sample from a sputum or a nasal swipe from somebody that doesn't have COVID, you have to know what the false positive rate is. Otherwise, you're going to create a national or international disaster. And Peter Marks of the FDA wrote back and said, I'll take that under advisement with my team. And they didn't. Ultimately, this is really technical, but ultimately, their entire diagnostic paradigm is inappropriate for mass testing. It's a disaster. If you tested everyone in the next 2 weeks in the United States with PCR, you'd have a 99.9% false positive rate. That's how it works, because you have a sample, the person either gets tested or they don't. And the more you test, the more people that go into a tree that goes like this: test positive, maybe you have it, maybe you don't. Test negative, maybe you have it, maybe you don't. The doctor can overrule the negative and throw you back into presumed COVID. The CDC stopped separating presumed COVID and actual COVID a long time ago. So there's test negative people that have presumed COVID, they're counting towards the positive. And then the PCR positives go, and then they might have a respiratory illness that's not COVID. They might test positive due to false positives, and then they might have the influenza A or B. They might have respiratory syncytial virus. They might have bacterial pneumonia, and they're not getting appropriately treated for bacterial pneumonia. So what's going to happen? They're going to have sepsis and die.
Well, that's what I want to ask too, because you can kind of make sense of this for me. So if you're testing positive for that specific coronavirus, and then you have the symptoms that are similar to COVID but could be something else, how would they know? for sure that it's due to that virus and it's not something else. Did you freeze? I think you froze. You still there? Okay, you're back. You froze for a second. Did you get my question? So
Yes.
yeah, because like, okay, so you test positive and then you have these symptoms that are they're similar to COVID symptoms. How do you know for sure it was caused by that virus and not another virus?
One thing that you can do is you can test for the other viruses or the bacteria, right? But the most important thing you can do is to actually sequence part of the virus to know if it's there. And again, highly technical, but we use primers when we do PCR. So this is a primer that hits the viral target genome here, another one that hits here, and then we can sequence what's between those two primer sites, okay? Well, Dr. Lee actually nests the primers so that they overlap so that you can actually determine if there's mutations in the primer that cause that particular primer to fail. So we know how to do this with 100% accuracy. The sequencing is 100% accurate, and Dr. Lee, his bid to provide coronavirus testing for the FDA was initially denied by the FDA because it was called a complex procedure, complex laboratory. But then he went and got CLIA approval because it's already an FDA approved test for viruses. So he's in Milford, Connecticut, and anyone can have their samples sent there by your doctor. You just have to contact Dr. Singhang Lee in Milford, Connecticut, Milford Diagnostics. But this research that we're doing should put the nail in the coffin of this false positive issue, because I can prove in one sentence that the CDC does not have control over the false positives. They know that they're there, right? They can't deny it anymore. It's in the scientific literature. That's because they're not adjusting their official numbers for false positives. There's no adjustment for the false positive rate, right? And they adjust for everything, right? When they do their assessment on whether vaccines cause autism or whether the influenza virus caused Guillain-Barré syndrome, they adjusted for every other possible risk factor. Well, what about the false positive rate? We knew early on from a study in Australia that the false positive rate was at least 11%. And then they had a study of Marines that were recruited to a study in their boot camp. They were all on the same college campus. No one else was on the campus except for their trainers. And they tested every Marine recruit every day. Now, someone brought COVID to the campus. One of them or two of them were positive, they think. They tested everyone every day, but they could only get a viable sequence out of like 76% of them. So there was at least a 34, 35, 36% false positive. That's then. Now we know that the virus has evolved to the point where the actual primer sequences themselves have been the target of evolution. And we have variants that have escaped the PCR test. So there's literally no confidence. The PCR testing is completely unreliable for the diagnosis of COVID anyway. It sounds crazy, right? Because all of medicine's using the PCR test, or are they? Or are they just taking people's nasal swabs with the antigen test as sufficient evidence for COVID and treating it like it's COVID? It's a mess. And it's always been a mess with respiratory illnesses, respiratory viruses, and bacteria in particular. Because prior to 2014, if you were given a diagnosis of influenza, it was determined that you had influenza with a test, the actual influenza virus. Okay. From 2014 on, they started to throw in everything. If you weren't molecularly tested to not be something else, it was presumed to be COVID, but they called it influenza disease. It's an actual category. But they knew that it was influenza A, B, RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, bacterial pneumonia, and all these others, and coronavirus. But then when coronavirus started taking its lion's share of the mortality and morbidity, then they said, oh, well, wait a minute, we have to change the label on that bucket. Then they changed the label to coronavirus. That's why influenza went away for a year. So they're playing diagnostic games. They know it. We know it. The politicians now know it. High-ranking politicians now know it. So I think it's just a matter of time before that particular house of cards comes falling down too. But we never see anyone held accountable. That's the difficulty here. We never see anyone who it was legally or ethically or morally, actually, the CDC should be fined for what they're doing. There should be some sanction, take a big chunk out of their hide with the funding that they think they have for all their pet projects, for screwing us over. All of this false testing baloney led to the lockdown. They inflated their numbers. It scared people. And then, true to form, CDC, when the vaccinated started getting COVID, they decided to change the criteria for the test from cycle threshold up to 40, 45. I'm sure you talked about this with Jesse, and down to 20, less than 26, less than 27, and you're hospitalized or you're dead. And what that means is that they were trying to reduce the public's perception and awareness of breakthrough cases so they could say it was an epidemic of the unvaccinated. Well, now we know in the UK that most of the people who are hospitalized with Omicron or dying from Omicron are triple vaccinated. Triple vaccinated. That's a huge, huge finding. I would encourage everybody to understand that antibody-dependent enhancement is most likely and responsible for this. Dr. Fantini from France did a fantastic study with his crew. Fantini, Fantini. I wrote about this on my Substack, Popular Rationalism, where it was really clear that the virus is coming out of Wuhan. There was a collection. There's not just one virus that came out of Wuhan. There was a collection of them that came out. But the Wuhan virus itself would not interact with the antibody to facilitate cellular entry of the virus, right? But the antibodies against Wuhan for alpha, so that if you had antibodies against the Wuhan virus and then you had the alpha infection, there was no antibody-dependent enhancement, right? But then when you got to gamma, the antibody-dependent enhancement was ready to go. And that fits under the definition of pathogenic priming, where you're exposed to the vaccine. So once they finally came out with the vaccine, and they pushed the vaccine in December, the Asian population already had antibodies to the SARS-CoV-1 virus. So they didn't experience so much of this. But the European population was a virgin soil population for the virus. And they were vaccinating in December of 2021, just as Delta came in. And so Fantini specifically found that antibody-dependent enhancement, when you have antibodies against Wuhan, but you're infected with Delta, the antibodies against Wuhan helped Delta infect your cells even more easily. And that drove that surge. And of course, I wrote about this on my Substack, along with the miracle in Africa, where we have no COVID, right? I don't know what the situation is right now. If they successfully vaccinated, we might see them now. But in Gibraltar, there was no COVID, and everyone was vaccinated. There was no COVID over the summer after everyone was vaccinated, and until they decided to start the booster program in October, they saw this huge burst of COVID in Madagascar, even though they had a 144% vaccination coverage on the population. So you can't vaccinate. Everyone knows now, even CDC, you can't vaccinate your way out of this. It's going to circulate. It has negative efficacy if you look at the data closely. Negative efficacy means that if you're vaccinated, you're more likely to get the infection. And so they're hanging on this thin tendril of a thread by claiming that you're less likely to be hospitalized if you have been vaccinated. But they only define fully vaccinated 5 weeks after your first exposure for the mRNA vaccines. So you have 5 weeks that you might be hospitalized with COVID if you're vaccinated. So that's baloney. And they did this with efficacy right from the beginning on the Moderna study. They said that 95% efficacy was never 95%. You redo the math, you throw those people back in that they threw out, it's 75%. We never would have launched a population-wide vaccination program with a 75% efficacy. So it was doomed to start from the beginning. And people need to be held accountable for this. They really do. We need to find a way to hold these people accountable for dragging us all through this. And then the denial of early treatment, which I've been all over interviewing, writing articles about. with Peter McCullough, Pierre Corey, and everyone else. So it's not as though history's not going to get this right, right? So it's your job, my job, everyone's job to make sure that the historians, when they write the story here, get the entire scope of the story. And it's like, you know, how long did it take before everyone in the United States of America said, yeah, Iraq was an unethical war? It took a long time, but you can't find somebody that feels like Iraq was an ethical war. You can't. So this is going to be the same thing. It's going to be a matter of time. And the faster it happens, the sooner the untrustworthiness of the CDC is going to become more apparent to everyone. And then we won't have another risk of this kind of crap again.
Yeah, this whole thing almost reminds me of this documentary I watched a while ago called The Syndrome, which was, I don't know if you ever watched it. It's about shaking baby syndrome, and it was basically bad science, that this idea that shaking baby syndrome, that the parents were shaking their children and it was causing these neck and head injuries, and now and it was just like based on really bad science. Parents actually got kids taken away from them, and some parents actually did time, went to prison because of this science, and then some very moral, willing to be outspoken scientists and doctors are like, there's no science behind this. There's no way that you can diagnose this child with shaking baby syndrome and be certain that it was because of the children's been shaken till injury by their kids. And it was like a really heart-wrenching story. But the reason why it's similar to this is that it thank God that there's people, doctors and scientists out there who have a heart, who are moral, and are willing to maybe do the unpopular thing of being outspoken to for the greater good. And I can't thank guys enough like yourself, like Dr. Peter McCullough, Dr. Jessica Rose, Dr. Pierre Corey, all these amazing people that have been able to be. I mean, if I'm outspoken, it's not, I mean, that's not my world. I'm not a scientist. I'm not going to be turned against by people in my field. You guys are taking some risk and taking some backlash to be outspoken, and but thank God you are, because like you said, I hope that when history is eventually written, that your names are there saying that, hey, you know what, all the experts that agreed, well, there was plenty of people who could foresee this issue and foresee the damage that was being done, and were outspoken, and they were trying to get people's attention and trying to stop this before it went too far. But there's always the concern. And Dr. Pierre Corey, when he was on my show with Dr. Jessica Rose, remember we talked about it. He showed it, the graph of polio, and how the rates went down, and then they introduced the vaccine, and the history books give all the credit to the vaccine, even though you really shouldn't have. That's my concern of something like that happening, where just like they're going to rewrite history, give all the credit to the vaccine about why we got through 2020 and the whole COVID scare. But I hope that, and it seems like the truth can only be suppressed for so long, the narrative changing. And maybe you can leave us with this, like why do you think the narrative's changing? Is there something we should look out for in the upcoming months and maybe years, with maybe pushing RNA vaccines for other stuff? Maybe what is it that maybe is the next thing that we should be looking out for? Because obviously the elite, the big pharma, the eugenicists, whoever it may be, that's pulling the strings in one direction or another, the Bill Gates of the world, they're not done, and they're always we always have to keep fighting. And it's not like after the whole COVID thing is over that we can kind of go back to, like you said, playing sports and forgetting about this. Is there something you think that we should look out for that in the upcoming months, maybe years? I know you look at decades, maybe the upcoming decades.
Sure. Well, people used to ask me this, how are they going to get people to forget about COVID? And I said, the same way they did it after the Spanish flu, there's going to be a war. And we've got, saber rattling and wagging the dog over there in Crimea. So that's one thing to look out for. But
That's a really good point. Yeah.
They are not going to succeed. They're not going to succeed in burying this. And I say that because the reason why they changed the narrative, Ricky, is because their overreach went too far, and they started risking the entire pediatric vaccination program. Because once somebody says, I had that vaccine and that hurt me, and then I went to my doctor and the doctor said, no, it wasn't the vaccine. And then they turned to the media, and the media said, no, myocarditis is rare. And then they turned to, the officials. They might call the FDA, they might contact the CDC, they might have to sue or, apply for damages somewhere. That awareness is so much more powerful than the expectation. The expectation is there's not going to be any problem, but their awareness becomes so much more powerful. And mathematically, I define the difference between a person's awareness and their expectation as disappointment. You take the total awareness that they have about what's really happening and the expectation, who's lying to them, that amount of disappointment that is present. If it's large enough, they'll become an activist, right? Even if it's, and I think this is independent of their personal character. There's not a person in the world that would not warn someone. That I would hope that there's not a person in the world that would not warn someone that a bridge is out if they see them traveling 30, 40 miles in their car towards a bridge. You have a duty to warn other people, unless you're, stoned high on drugs or something, nothing against people that want to use marijuana, whatever. But so the reality is we won. It's just a matter of time until the rest of, like I said, 40 or 45% of America wakes up. They want to end the discussion. They want to stop giving by continuing to put out disinformation and propaganda on a failed vaccination program would give us a very hefty platform. And but they probably realize that they've gone too far. They went far too far with their falsities, their lies, their false narratives. And way too many people woke up. But every time a person's injured or killed by a vaccine, you create dozens of vaccine risk-aware Americans, not just one. A death in a family, obviously, that person's painfully no longer aware. He's of anything, they're dead. But the rest of the family then wakes up, the neighbors wake up. Yeah, when they start seeing it over and over and over again, there's a pattern. Well, that's to a large extent why we're where we are, because social media brought people together that had common shared experiences, and they could relate and corroborate what was happening in different parts of the country. So I want to leave you with the optimism that, if we take out CDC, it's our responsibility to build a reliable, trustworthy system of medicine and public health. Public health is not about medical care. They're not trained in medical care, yet they carry the authority. And like I said, they have infected, their mindset has infected allopathy. All they are is, at this point in time, the only thing they have is authority. They don't have virtue, they don't have truth, they don't have science on their side. So what this means is there's a vacuum. How we fill that vacuum is very important. Now, some people might say, oh, this guy's crazy, he doesn't understand. They're trying to pass mandates in Washington state against the children. It's mandated for the children, he's out of touch. No, I'm aware of all of that. But I can see the next football after the last one. And yes, if they mandate against children anywhere in school, it will be devastating to the vaccination program in the United States of America. Because the children that come home with myocarditis, the little soccer players that pass out on the field, the children that are hospitalized with serious COVID because of antibody-dependent enhancement, and we haven't had deaths in children from COVID, nothing that's worth mentioning, and talk about rare. But now if they start skyrocketing after they're all vaccinated, there's no way that the parenting population in the United States is not going to lose that. So that means the entire vaccination program will be dealt with accordingly. There'll be a giant walk away movement, and people will become more politically active than you've ever seen. And I hope that doesn't have to happen. I hope that we can all come to a realization, well, let's dispense with the CDC's power and influence now without killing a bunch of kids first in order to get there. It's really important that we not do that. So I'm totally against mandates. I'm totally against this vaccine for children. If the risk is as bad as it is for male teens, what is it really for myocarditis and death? In 6-year-olds, what is it really? We really don't know. So, thank you, so much for having me. It's been great chatting with you again. Yeah.
Same here. I think we hyped up Jessica Rose and her ability to have an interesting conversation, but obviously you're no slouch yourself. You all you need is Jessica's laugh, because I think people love Jessica's laugh. I get so many comments like I can listen to her laugh all day. So but yeah, I mean, so many fascinating things you brought up. Like one, just for people to ponder on after listening to this. I mean, the fact that the Ukraine stuff is getting all the headlines now, and that, like you said, that's a great way of getting us to forget about COVID and the mandates and maybe people who are getting harmed from it, and switching our attention to something else. That's really fascinating. And then the other thing too is that maybe the narrative is changing, and so drastically. Now Pfizer has even they taken some steps back. I think it was Pfizer, right? Who now aren't going to try to get it approved for kids quite yet. They said they're going to still do some more research or something like that. It's like the narrative's changing so drastically that maybe you're right. Maybe it is one of those things where it's like they know that they're just the whole thing's gonna be just completely exposed if they keep going this far. I mean, personally, I feel like it probably should have been exposed already. Like, well, how much more evidence do you need? But obviously, when you have big tech on your side who is suppressing, unbreaking science and the Ripple Effect podcast, since I got banned off YouTube, you can go on Google or YouTube and search for my show, and you can't find it. You can't, it's the algorithms are not working in our favor. So it's maybe that is one of the concerns too, is that they're going to take it too far, and then everybody's going to question every vaccine. I mean, Del Bigtree and people like yourself. I mean, a lot of people have been outspoken about having actual good research for vaccine safety studies. Actually have safety studies for vaccines. Even before COVID-19, they were talking about this. Having, they're not anti-vax. They just want good research and good studies that actually show that they're safe and effective. And maybe they're concerned that, like, that's exactly what's going to happen. If they take it too far, that everybody's going to just be skeptical of all vaccines, and then they're all going to have to go through much tougher studies and go through much more studies just to prove that their products are safe. So yeah, I like to end it on an optimistic way. Like maybe that is what's going on, and hopefully hopefully we're both right, and the truth will eventually be exposed, and we'll have more and more people waking up to what's going on, and then we'll be complaining and fighting and trying to expose the next corruption. But
I am so looking forward to that. I mean, this is the thing, right? The way I've planned my life is to be a problem solver, and when this particular problem of the CDC and regulatory compliance is solved, regulatory capture is solved, then I will look to the next problem. Or maybe I'll give myself 5 years of just academic research for the sake of academic research. I want to understand the evolution of consciousness, for instance. I just want to know. I just want to look into stuff for the sake of knowing. And guys like Pierre Corey and Peter McCullough, and thank you for including me in that list when you mentioned them. The thing that distinguishes us is not so much that we're activists. We're just curious. We're inquisitive. We want to know, the nature of reality. We don't want to just accept a platform that somebody says, this is reality, now live this way and live that way. We're curious. And it's always the kids that ask why, that are the most annoying. So if that's a badge of honor to be annoying, then I'm going to be annoying for some time. So thank you, Ricky.
Well, hey, thanks, Dr. Jack. I really appreciate your time. Hopefully we'll stay in touch and we talk again in the near future.
You can count on it, and hang out when you're done recording if you can. I've got a message for you.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me end this. Thank you for listening, guys.